Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Roars, and it's almost 1:30, so we're just going to start, and as people come in, we'll just let them in. But thank you for joining today. I'm really excited about this session on how to start a podcast. We have Kimberly Evans here, who has a podcast that I listen to personally. And so I think it's really fun to have somebody that I listen to with us today. We've been doing this series of webinars for a number of years. And so it's like in my mind, we have a little bit of celebrity here today. So it's exciting. So before we get started, I just want to read a land acknowledgement as we are with the Indigenous Business Development Services Program and Sage Hill Community Futures. So as we gather here today, we acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. And Jenny, if you just want to introduce yourself, that would be great.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jenny Glessman, and I'm with the Sage Hill Community Futures Office. We hold the IBDS, or Indigenous Business Development Services contract. So we're here to help business owners get started, expand, any of those types of things. We offer loans, advice, and support. And we actually have our Community Futures program. We actually have 13 offices across the province that all are here to help business owners get started and move their businesses forward. One of the ways we do that is with training. And that's why we're excited to learn about podcasts today. I know nothing. So I am actually sitting here with my husband, and I also own a business. So I have my business hat on now, and I'm here to learn for our business as well. So welcome. Kimberly, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the lovely introduction. It's been funny when I started podcasting 2.5 years ago. I do find now it's sort of like how when you hear somebody on the radio, but you've never actually seen what they look like. And then when you hear their voice, you recognize it, but then you see them and you're like, oh, wait a second. That isn't at all what I thought you were going to look like based on what I've imagined you to look like with that voice. So I do get that sometimes now. So that's funny. I am not a celebrity, but you guys have made me feel very welcome. So thank you. So I am Kimberly Evans, and I have owned my own business starting in event planning 20 years ago. So I feel like a seasoned entrepreneur, and my career has evolved, ebbed and flowed, like I'm sure all of your lives have throughout the last 2 decades. And in 2019, I decided that I really wanted to launch a podcast. So with having event planning and doing marketing and public relations for mostly women-led businesses, I work with everyone, but that is sort of the main clientele that I do in my business. And so my company is called Joy PR Studio. And I knew that from a PR and event planning and marketing background that I wanted to continue to use creative ways to market my business. And a podcast felt like a unique thing to try and do in order to do that. So I was sort of teaching myself as I went along. It was one of those kind of just Google till you make it type of scenarios that I'm sure all of you can relate with. And I always like hearing stories like that from other people because I feel like it helps me be reminded that anything is possible, that we don't have to have a degree in podcasting in order to be able to be a podcaster. And I think that that's pretty amazing. So I decided that I wanted to have a podcast to sort of just bring another medium into my business as to how information could be put out there. And I think everybody receives and hears information differently. Some people like watching videos. Some people like reading and researching and textbooks and papers. Some people like listening to audio. And so I felt like I had a fairly strong social media presence. I send out a regular email newsletter in my business, and just felt like podcasting sort of was like another piece that I could add to my tickle trunk of marketing repertoire in order to kind of get the message out about what I did, as well as elevate voices of other business owners across Saskatchewan, Canada, and the world. I've had guests from all over on my podcast. So now, since 2019, I am I think this week was, I have my amazing team member, Angie, who's on the call today. And I think we're at 133 episodes now of the podcast. So it's come a long way, but it's been a labor of love. And so I want to bring the how to today to this workshop, but also this is a safe place to ask questions. There are no silly questions. Like I said, I fumbled my way through figuring out how to start a podcast, and I was just so determined to make it happen that I did. And it's been really a really successful tool for me to use in my business and in my life with the people that I've gotten to meet through having this as an avenue. So I want to start. So please feel free. Once I share my screen and put my presentation on, I won't be able to as easily see if somebody has a question. So if Jenny and Jessica, you guys are okay with people just like either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask. Like, this can be very casual. I don't want this to feel like you have a burning question and you have to just like wait to the end, but we'll also have a Q&A at the end. So if you want to think about it, you could even pop the question into the chat if you don't want to forget about it, and then we can address those later too. But if it's in regards to something we're speaking about right at that time, I don't mind if you just jump in and ask questions. This is a nice small group today. Okay, so I am going to share my screen here. Okay, now. Okay. Okay, I can't see anybody anymore. So can someone just unmute and just let me know that you can for sure see what I'm sharing with you?
Yep.
Yes,
I
it's
can.
perfect.
Yep.
Mhm.
Excellent. Okay, wonderful. So if you have you will all receive this presentation afterwards. So you will get all of this, but if you are either typing or have a notebook and are writing, I really want this workshop to be something that you feel you get to the end of it and you understand how you might be able to do this for yourself. I always find when I'm in something and I'm listening to things and it's all good and you're listening and then you get to the end of it and you're like, but wait, I still don't actually know how to do this. So I hope that I have created this in a way where it sounds like maybe most of us are beginners to podcasting here. So if there are questions of any level, please don't hesitate. Okay. So where to begin? I think that's usually the first question that I get asked quite a bit, because that was my first question when I started 4 years ago, was where do you even begin? It's all fun and games like listening to podcasts, but how does one actually get it from an idea that we're thinking about to something that anyone can actually listen to? So there's a little bit of planning that needs to happen in starting anything, I think, but specifically in starting a podcast. I think it's important, and you can evolve a podcast. To me, I mean, I don't know how many podcasts there are in all of the world, but I would imagine we're probably at millions of them, because anybody can start one. This is free game to really put a podcast out there of whatever topic you so choose. And there are many reasons why people decide to podcast. And I think when you're starting something like this, podcasting is definitely, at least in my experience, I think maybe if you are a celebrity or you already have a really large public following in some regard on social media or the way that you've created your business, I think it can be easier then for a podcast to also turn into something that would be very successful when it comes to revenue to bring money in for you. But a podcast really is not a quick get rich quick scheme. So that's definitely, if you think that starting a podcast is like where you want to really make money, Definitely put that on the back burner, but I can promise you this, it really is a great way to bring more awareness and attract things to your business, and it can generate revenue. I do generate some revenue from my podcast, so it is possible. It's just something that kind of takes some time in order to get it to a place where it could do that. So to start things off, you really need to decide what you want your podcast to be about. And like I said, if anyone has scrolled through Spotify recently or through Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts, you know that there is everything and anything when it comes to topics for a podcast. And so I think the ones that often end up being a little bit more successful are ones that kind of have a little bit of a niche to them, and you start building a following of people that are like excited to hear what you're putting out there. So choosing your topic is important. So I know some of you, as we were just chatting before this, were already just talking about like you own a business or whatever the reason. So I'm going to be speaking to this from like a business standpoint today, but there's obviously just personal reasons and just for out of just passion and joy of a topic that some people like to start podcasts as well. You really want to pick something that's going to align with, if you're using it as a tool to market your business, which is what I use mine for, you really want to make sure that the topic aligns with that. So think of things that you're interested in or passionate about, because you can hear it. When someone is talking about something, there would be a lot of podcast topics that I would really struggle to talk about because they just wouldn't be things that would be up my alley, and I would have to try really hard to make it sound exciting. So a good podcast should also, if you're using it for your business, it should be kind of tied into needs of your audience. And what I mean by that is, in my business with marketing, PR, event planning, and my clientele are business owners. I am marketing my clients to business owners because that's who I do. So mostly women. So the topics that I'm picking are topics that are going to be applicable for women in business, just so that the people that I would actually want as clients, if anyone was listening to my podcast and they were hearing what we were talking about, that would be kind of a bit of a direct correlation. And then you also just really, I think one of the most important things is just figuring out the why you want to have a podcast, like we kind of talked about before. So figure out your why is really important, because it's such a slow process when it comes to a podcast being something that would actually start bringing in revenue. It brings in a lot of really great things. And I do not define the success of a business by just revenue. It has to have revenue in order for it to be called a business, or else it's a hobby. But other than that, I think there's a lot of ways that businesses are successful, and it's whatever you want your business to look like. But your why for your podcast is important. So figuring out, are you using this podcast in order to have this as a marketing tool to kind of drive people towards your business in a different way? Are you wanting your podcast to just strictly be very educational, and you're really just wanting to educate people on whatever the topic is that you're choosing? Are you wanting to use a podcast to meet new people? And that's definitely been a part of, it was a secondary purpose in mine. I didn't realize how having a podcast would make it so much easier to reach out to people that I maybe don't already have a relationship with or am not connected to in some way, because it gives them a reason to connect with you, because you can do something like a podcast interview together. So I would really encourage you today, as we're going through, to just be writing or typing, however you're taking notes today. Just brainstorm a couple ideas on all of the steps we're going to walk through today as we're going through it in live time, or as you're listening to this afterwards. If you're listening to this afterwards and you want to press pause once you have the recording, you can do that and just write down a few things, so that by the time you get to the end of this workshop, you actually have some more ideas and maybe a little bit of a clearer picture for yourself on what your podcast could look like. So choosing your style. So there are lots of different types of podcasts. There are some where it's just one person sharing things. Some of my episodes are that way in my Joy Curator podcast, where it's just me talking to you as a listener. There are also ones that are multi group. So maybe you have multiple people and there's like almost like a round table panel style discussion that you might have, or it's a one-on-one interview. There's the person interviewing and there's a guest who's on there. Maybe it's more storytelling. There's a lot of true crime type podcasts where it's really just like almost like a news article type of scenario where you're jumping to different formats and different types of things. So you have to decide what your style is and what you would like. I jump between ones that are just me one-on-one, or just me by myself, and then one-on-one interviews on there. And so it's okay for the style to have different ones, but you kind of have to keep it in some semblance. You don't want 1 week to sound like it's sort of like a news thing, and then next week it's just you by yourself, and then next week you have like, you kind of need to figure out what your style is and what feels right for you. And sometimes that maybe takes a little bit of time to figure out, and definitely listening to different styles of podcasts where you as the person listening can say, oh, this is really resonating with me as a listener. You can kind of glean which things feel best for you. And so you can decide also, will you have, how many episodes are you going to put out? Are you going to put out an episode every week? Are you just doing one once a month? Are you going to have seasons where maybe you do 12 episodes as like a season, and then maybe you break for a few months and then do another? You can decide. What I learned a little ways in, and I thought that once I started, I had to do it the exact same way for the rest of my life. And I realized that putting an episode out once a week took a lot of time, energy, and effort. And while that is still the format that I do right now, I've definitely shrunk down and started doing seasons where I have seasons and then a break. And then I can prepare for the next season of 8 or 12 episodes, and then I can have a break again. Just so that as your life and business ebbs and flows, you can make sure that you're staying consistent in some type of way. Because I know sometimes I'll go and listen to a podcast and I'll look and be like, oh, they haven't actually posted an episode for a year. And I'm less likely to kind of stay engaged then, because I know that there's nothing new that's going to be coming out. So I would encourage you to listen to a few different types of podcasts, maybe just scroll through some of the popular ones on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and just see which ones kind of feel right for you and which ones you think suit best your original purpose for your podcast. So you can't take the planning out of a planner. So of course I had to create an outline. So I think it's really important that even though I really love podcasts that feel really casual, I always want, when someone is listening to my podcast, to feel like they're sort of just like joining us for a cup of coffee, and that they're just kind of a part of the conversation. That's what I like them to feel like. But sometimes in order for something to be able to be made to look effortless, you have to put some effort into it. Otherwise, it can get a little messy and a little chaotic, and it doesn't have sort of like a streamlining feel that can keep an audience engaged. So making an outline, and this again can really only happen once you've decided on your topic and style of podcast that you're going to do. So an outline is really just, what do you want an episode to be like for your podcast? And you'll also glean some of this information as you're listening to other podcasts. You'll start to notice, if you're paying attention, you'll notice that maybe this podcast starts off with a little bit of music at the beginning. Maybe this podcast has like an intro, and maybe it has a little snippet of something that you're going to hear later on in the conversation, but they have that snippet at the beginning as like a little teaser of what you can expect, and then an intro, and then it's the actual conversation. Maybe there's an advertisement or two in there. Listening to the flow of the podcast is going to be sort of what helps you understand what you like, first of all, and what you think will be the best for your audience, potential audience, and then create an outline around that. So you really can just kind of brainstorm and do some research by listening to other podcasts in order to kind of lay out what you want this to look like. And then, as well as whatever that episode's topic is, really make sure that you understand what should all be included in the either things that you're sharing or the conversation you're having as an interview style with somebody else. So these steps all kind of really flow. I've made these steps intentionally today to kind of flow in a very linear way as to this is where you start and this is where you end, so that you can really figure out how to get all of the middle pieces in before you launch your podcast. So again, if you are planning on having an interview style podcast where you will be bringing like a guest on the show and you'll be talking about the topic together with them, it's really important to kind of plan this out a little bit. It's really important for you to, I always find for myself, I do research, but I bring people on who I sometimes know and sometimes don't know, but my method is the same for both of them. Even when it's somebody that I do know, I like to do a little bit of more research on them, because sometimes there's certain things even about people that we're close with that we're like, oh, wait, I didn't actually know that about you. So it's really important that you're knowledgeable about the person and that you've shown genuine interest in them and what they're doing, even prior to reaching out to them to ask if they would maybe potentially be on your show. So research, and then you can prepare some questions. And depending on how long your intention is, I've started shortening my episodes, some of them a little bit, but I find an episode 45 minutes to an hour, no problem. The conversation just flows when you're really enjoying each other's company. So by preparing questions and sending them to the person that you're interviewing ahead of time, it really does help kind of stay in a time frame that you're wanting for your conversation. And then really just asking them the right questions so that the conversation can really have a flow and you're not just getting yourself into yes or no answers. And when you've done your research, chances are maybe somebody you're having on your podcast may have been on someone else's podcast before, and you could actually go and listen to something that they've done before. You can hear their style a little bit, and you really have to account for all of this into your own episodes. It does take quite a bit of time for this like preparation piece, as well as getting into the actual conversation and recording of the podcast. So yeah, think about what you want this to look like. If you are doing an episode on your own and you're not interviewing something, there still needs to be a bit of a plan, a little bit of an outline, some of the things that you want to make sure that you talk about. And when I'm doing solo episodes by myself, I don't have like a whole script that's out for the whole episode, but I do have some bullet points that I've created ahead of time, just so that I know as I'm glancing at it while I'm recording, that I'm flowing kind of through what I wanted the message of that particular topic to be. So you can even do this research while you're listening to other podcasts. Again, it's like a great way to research. Nothing would flatter me more than somebody listening to an episode of my podcast and dissecting it completely and gleaning what you like, what you don't like, and just going through it, because you get to bring your own unique creative spin to something that you are launching. And that's why no two podcasts are the same. There are tons of people that have podcasts that are the exact same topics as me: women, entrepreneurship, self-improvement, that kind of thing. But every one of them has a different take on it. And your audience will slowly start gleaning towards you based on pieces of yourself. And the more genuine and authentic you are, you will just attract, as well as there will be some people that don't relate to you on it, which is great, because you continue to then bring in the people that are your target audience. So like I said, so here's a few tips for kind of like effective interviewing. So you can listen to interviews, and these don't have to just be other podcast interviews. You could go on YouTube, you could watch the news, you can do anything like that in regards to just kind of seeing how people interact with each other. And then another thing that you can do, and I've done this before, and it feels a little bit nerve-wracking at first if you're not used to speaking in front of someone else, but it's nice to do it with like a safe person. It could be a friend, it could be a business colleague or somebody that you know, and you could either in real life or just on a Zoom call, you could practice interviewing. So you could just pretend that you have chosen your friend as the person that you are interviewing. You could come up with questions, and you can do this whole process we've talked about, steps 1, 2, 3, and go through all of the things so that you can kind of practice what it feels like to be the interviewer. Just kind of having some of those guiding conversations. What happens when you're talking to somebody and they maybe spin their response a little bit differently maybe than you thought it was going to go? How do you kind of lean into the next question? How do you keep the conversation flowing if maybe their answers are shorter and you were hoping for them to elaborate a little bit more? So it's really important to understand that podcasting is really just storytelling, but there is a bit of an art to it, and it is why we find ourselves resonating maybe towards some and not others based on what our preferences are. So once you have your outline and your kind of interview questions and the things, all of those pieces kind of put together, you really do want to have a little bit of a script. Now, there's certain pieces of the podcast, and if you want to think, we'll get into this a little bit further towards the end when we're talking about kind of more of the like technicalities of podcasting, like the editing and the recording and those types of pieces. But having a script is really important for certain pieces that you're recording. I find for myself, when I am recording the intro for an episode where I'm like giving the person's bio and details about them and like what this episode is going to be about, I have a full script typed up for it that I'm reading while I'm recording, and I'm still just using my own language in it, and I'm making it sound very casual, but it really helps me to record it very clearly and eloquently, and I'm able to make sure that I get all of the facts and the details in about the guest that I want to share. So there are definitely pieces, advertisements as another example. If you're wanting advertisements down the road in order to monetize the podcast, having a bit of a script. But for me, I feel like script sometimes gets a bad rap because script sounds very rehearsed and choreographed and polished. And it really is just, I type the same way that I write or the way that I speak for my script. So you really want it to sound just like you. But when you are recording, there are times where at the very beginning when I was podcasting, I could tell that if I didn't have a script, I just sounded sometimes a little bit more either way too casual or robotic, and I really wasn't sharing what I really wanted to share because I just wasn't quite sure where I was going with my conversation. So having a script was definitely really helpful. And what some people record video of them podcasting too, but most people just do the audio piece of it. So nobody's seeing it. You can just have your script there with you and it's no big deal, but it just kind of gives you a clearer sense of what you're telling your story about and that kind of thing. So putting together a full script, at the bottom of this thing, it says gather any additional sound files. So by script, I mean everything that's happening beginning to end. So like we said before, maybe there's music at the beginning, maybe there's an intro, and then maybe it's the interview, and then maybe 15 minutes into the interview, maybe there's an advertisement, and maybe there's music that goes along in and out with it. And we'll get into all of those details, but the script is sort of like, if somebody else had to follow along, would they be able to understand what's happening next? Kind of making it to that level so that you feel clear on the direction that the episode is going. The other part too is, what stories are you hoping to share in your podcast? And this kind of comes back from the beginning when you're kind of thinking about like what your topic is and what you're even wanting this podcast to be about. Really deciding what feels engaging for you, what are you wanting to share, and what do you think is going to connect the dots the most for people that are listening to this and are then potentially maybe wanting to use your business's services afterwards because of listening to this episode and sort of understanding more about a certain topic. So I put this in here just so that after the fact, there could be sort of a deeper dive on some questions where you can use these as a starting point for what you may want to share in your own podcast. So you really want to make sure that, I always find for myself, I like to hear like the real details about somebody's life. And this, again, goes completely based on topic. If your topic is something that is just staying very like professional, we're just, these are 10 steps to this, that is absolutely fine also. Mine is a bit more of a storytelling one. And so I really do like to ask the questions that you know everyone is thinking but are afraid to ask. I like being able to go into that place so that by the end of the episode, you really feel like you've gotten to know the person that I'm interviewing. And so here's just a few examples of that you can kind of reference after the fact, once you're going back in and actually building out your own scripts and interview questions. Is there any questions so far, or anything that anyone has questions about? I hope that this is feeling like clear from the beginning. This second half of this is really going to get a little bit more into the actual technical side to a certain degree. There's a lot of ways that a podcast can be done, and I'm giving you one way today. But I want to make sure that from the first half of the actually just figuring out how to get started in the brainstorming stuff, that you're feeling comfortable with like knowing how you can do that for yourself.
It's great so far.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, please feel free to just jump in and ask questions if you need to, but we will have Q&A at the end. Okay, so from this whole brainstorming part of things and figuring it out, and we're getting interviews booked, and we're actually like going to be having these conversations now when we're creating the actual content that we're going to be putting into the podcast. I knew nothing when I started. I was like, how does it get from being a conversation to it actually being something that somebody can pop their earbuds in and listen to, and it just randomly magically shows up on Apple Podcasts or Spotify? I had no idea what that journey was in between. And I do not have professional expertise in this technical side of things. But again, I was so determined to figure this out myself that I just kept taking the next right step. Okay, I don't know how to do this. Okay, now I'm going to research how to do this. Okay, now there's one piece in here that I don't know how to do. I'm just going to research that one piece. And it was just little steps incrementally until it figured out. And it was really something that I was so proud of, because it wasn't stuff that I felt that I really had a background or a skill set in regards to the technical side of this. So it really is quite basic to start a podcast. You do not need a bunch of expensive equipment. There are ways to do podcasts that are incredibly elaborate, and they can be done in recording studios with millions of dollars of equipment. And they can also be done in your home with a computer and a microphone, which is what I do for mine. So you really just need to make sure that you have a computer and a microphone. And you can Google podcast microphones. Mine is one that just has like a USB plug in it, so that you can have it actually plugging into your computer while you're doing this. And you then also need to be able to record it. So I do record some of my interviews in real life with people where we're actually sitting together. Most of the ones, especially because I was only podcasting for 6 months before the pandemic hit. And so throughout that time, obviously everything was done remotely for the most part. And so Zoom and things like that, where you can record just like what we're doing today, is a really easy way to just record the conversation, and then you are able to convert your Zoom video file that you get at the end of it into an audio file to use for podcasting. And and then also having some editing software in order to be able to splice things together. This was the part that gave me the most stress when I started, because it just seemed so difficult and complicated, and it was not at all something that I felt like I had the skill set to do. But again, in all of my Googling, I use a program called Audacity, and I am sharing this today because this is what I use. There are tons of options, so feel free to do your research and find something that works right for you. I find Audacity very user-friendly, and it kind of just allows you to, I'm not going to go into all of the full technicality things. I think we could probably have a separate workshop for just how to use Audacity, and a separate workshop for all of these other pieces too. But it really is something that I was able to, again, even once I landed on using Audacity, I was able to just kind of Google my way through getting tutorials and things on how to use it so that I could understand. And from there, once you understand how to do one, then you can kind of just quite simply keep recording them over and over again. And then you really just want a reasonably quiet space to record, something that doesn't have too high ceilings, kind of the lower ceilings as possible. I remember hearing one of my favorite podcasters, who has like millions and millions of listeners, say one time, she's like, I'm just sitting in my son's bedroom closet podcasting today because there's a lot of people home in my house. And I was like, okay, you know what? This is possible to do anywhere. And really, you don't need to have a special recording space, but having a place that just feels like it's not too echoey is a bit of the key, just so that you aren't kind of getting that be your sound. But you can kind of test it out. You can sit in a space with your computer and press record on Audacity and be talking into your microphone, and then listen to it back and just hear what it sounds like when you listen to it back. And that's how you can kind of gauge, does this sound like what I would hope for it to hear on the other end, or is it too echoey and I need to maybe move somewhere a little bit quieter? So in using a microphone, you really just want to make sure that your microphone is like close to you, and the same kind of thing, you can trial and error. You can talk into the microphone and then play it back to yourself and just hear what it sounds like, and make sure that it kind of sounds like what you're hoping for it to sound like on the other end for somebody to hear it. Now, when you're using, I think I mentioned this earlier, when you're listening to a podcast, when you're listening to somebody else's podcast, I want you to remember this part when you're listening to somebody else's podcast. So if you think about a podcast all kind of being separate little blocks based on, you're kind of building a podcast with blocks. So your intro music is a block. Your actual introduction is a block. The interview is a block. An advertisement is a block. Any other music that's playing somewhere else is another block. And just thinking about every single piece of those things being its own block. And that's how you're kind of building an episode together. So everything is kind of separate. You're recording your intro, you're then going to record the conversation, and you're kind of putting all of those things together. That's how you end up with like a full episode with all of those individual pieces, where that's what you would be sharing out to the world, sort of the complete and finished product. So editing your podcast, this is what we were just talking about with these blocks here. So you need to be able to edit it. So you do have to have something such as Audacity in order to be able to put all of these blocks together. So again, this is where, sort of coming back to the outline and the script that you're creating earlier, this is where you get to kind of go back and look at that and determine what order do all of these pieces need to be as I'm going through creating this podcast based on what I've decided I want my layout of my podcast to be. So you just need to make sure that you have all of those pieces. So there's a lot of places online where you can find royalty-free music that's like allowed allowed to be shared. A lot of stuff does have copyrights on it, so you do need to be careful that you're using things that you actually have permission to use. Some podcasts I've heard even have somebody that's like specifically recorded something just for them. So if you have somebody in your life who's musical or something along those lines, you could get something custom done up if you want like a special thing that's like just yours to be able to use for your podcast. You really can be as creative as you want for what you want this finished product to look like. And so while you're editing, you're really just building these blocks together, and you're getting yourself to the end where you have a finished product where that's what you would have somebody actually be listening to in the end. So you really do, these are here again for you to be able to reference later on. You really do need to kind of just get really specific and clear about what you want your podcast to be like. And listening to other ones is really great, but I definitely don't want you to take that as that's the only way to do it. If you have an idea and you're like, I've never actually thought of, I've never heard another podcast that does it like this before, that's great. You get to start something new then and put your own spin on what you want this to look like. And I do encourage you to, if you are using the podcast specifically for like a marketing tool for your business, where it's kind of directly correlated to your business, you really do want to make sure that there's some continuity between it. So if you have a logo or business colors or brand pack that you've created for your business, try to fuse that in a little bit with what you're doing in your podcast, knowing that your podcast is sort of like another marketing extension of your business. So as you can tell, even by this presentation, I love pink. I use pink all of the time, and I'm not ashamed of it. So I like to have pink be in sort of a lot of things. So even when I'm creating graphics for the podcast and that kind of thing, I just really like it to match the rest of my branding, because I would share my podcast episodes on my social channels. And just so that it kind of has that continuity of it, and people start recognizing that that podcast is connected to that business. So once you have actually created the whole entire episode, you've done the interview, you've edited it, you've gone through everything, and you have a finished product, which a podcast is essentially an MP3 file. That is what a podcast is. It is just an audio listening file. That is all that it is. So you have to be able to share this somewhere, because it's great to have an audio file, but if you have an audio file sitting on your computer, nobody can hear it. So you have to figure out where to put this. So this is where you need to actually have a place to host your podcast. So if you are a business and you already have a website for your business, that is a very logical and natural place. Some people have completely separate websites just for their podcast. My podcast is a page on my website. So I have mine like linked together, but it can be completely separate. You don't have to have this related to your business's podcast if you don't want to, but you do need a place for this podcast to kind of live. So you do need that. And then you also need to create an account. And this, again, this is what I use. There are tons of places that host podcasts. Now, these things are paid services. So my podcast, if it does cost me money, I do it as the most bare minimum cost as I possibly can. Because up until now, everything that I've said to you, besides purchasing a microphone and assuming you own a computer, you don't really need anything else. It's pretty easy to just kind of low budget to kind of get started, but you do need to have an account, because when you have your account with Spotify for podcasters, this is where you're actually having this is where your podcast, how it's getting distributed. This is how it's showing up on Spotify, showing up on Apple Podcasts, and these big platforms, Apple and Spotify, have all these small, teeny tiny little podcast platforms like that some people listen to podcasts on very unique apps, and Spotify and Apple kind of distributes and pulls to all of those unique apps too. So once you have it up on those two places, I don't even know where my podcast all shows up after that, because it gets pulled to lots of places, but I don't have to do anything about it. It just gets pulled. So you do need that in order for your podcast to actually be out there in the world. And then you also have to figure out how you are going to market the podcast. So it's one thing to have the podcast, and it's one thing to have it showing up on Spotify, have it showing up on Apple, and having it out there. But how does anybody actually know that it's there? Unless you're ranked number one, which maybe I'll put that on my vision board of things that I would love to be someday. But right now I'm like millions down the line of like all the other million podcasts that are on there. So you need to kind of figure out how you're going to get your audience to even know that your podcast exists. So one of the ways to do that, besides having it on your website, which is a great first place to have it, is also having creating like social media posts about it. So you can create a like graphic of some sort, a picture that maybe has the episode. You can look on my Joy Curator podcast Instagram if you want to see what mine look like. And you can create something that kind of said, oh, this is episode 133. This is the photo of like the guests that are on today. This is the title. And I always post that. Actually, my sweet Angie on the call posts that for me, posts it onto the social channels that we want it to be on. So I'll post, I have some separate social media handles that are just for my podcast. So I have my business Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn and website. And then I also have an Instagram for my podcast and a Facebook for my podcast, so that it's kind of like growing separate audiences that can kind of like share things to each other. So I'll post the same social media graphic on my business one, but I'll also post it on the podcast one, just to kind of be growing that podcast audience in there. So creating a little bit of a marketing and social media strategy around how you're promoting your podcasts is really important, or else all the work that you've created in putting this podcast out there may never really be like noticed by the people that see it. So that's kind of something to consider, that you kind of need to have your podcast be a part of the whole marketing plan that you have for your own business and whatever you do, and figure out how that fits together. And then there's tons of options that can go from, I could literally spend full time working on my podcast if I wanted to, because there's always like one more thing you could do here and one more thing you could do here, but you have to cut it somewhere. But you can create video clips. I often have audio clips. So if you again go to my Instagram for the Joy Curator podcast and you listen to some of them on there, you'll hear a little snippet of the interview of that episode that you're looking at, as a little bit of a trailer to like know what the episode is about, to kind of drive attention and get people to understand if that's something they want to listen to or not. So I put together a little bit of a checklist here that kind of just goes through like the linear, what we've talked about mostly today, of just how you can visualize this podcast episode as sort of like the whole big picture, and how do we break it down in order to get from the idea stage to it actually being out into the world where somebody can listen to it. So again, this is for reference for later in regards to planning your episode, writing the script, recording the episode, editing, publishing, creating that cover art so that you have a graphic that you can use on social media to share about the episode. And then you're uploading your episode to this podcast host, like Spotify for podcasters as an example, uploading it to your website so that it's also up there and it can be like pulled and people can listen to it right on your website as well, if they don't want to listen to it on an app like Apple, and then posting it on the social channels. So this is kind of a little bit of just like a step-by-step to look back, and I use a checklist like this for every single episode to make sure that I'm like kind of doing things in the same way. And once you do it once and you kind of get your feet wet in it, you're kind of just duplicating it every time. And then you know what to do, and you can always change it up and make this a little different here, but you kind of have the general idea so that you don't feel like the beginning will feel like a lot of work, and then it will slowly start to feel like, okay, I can get into a bit of a better rhythm of how this works. So I added in some of the resources here that just so that you could click these links later when you're listening to it, or copy and paste them into your browser. The Spotify for Podcasters is where it would get hosted. Audacity that I mentioned is the tool that I use for editing and recording on. And then Canva, which I'm sure most of you have all heard of and used. Canva is where all of our graphics get created for it, just to use it as a way to be able to make really pretty graphics that kind of match the brand and that sort of thing. And that's a wrap. I want to leave some time for Q&A here. Creating a podcast is really exciting and rewarding. I have just had so much joy brought to me and my business in being able to use this tool to reach out to people that, like I said earlier, that I maybe normally wouldn't have just called up and said, hey, do you want to meet for a coffee? It's almost like it gives you that like extra permission when you're inviting somebody to be a guest on your show. Everybody loves talking about themselves. So when you're inviting somebody to be able to be a guest on your show, I have only, Angie would be able to correct me on this. I've only maybe 3 times in 4 years had a no. And most of the no's are because it was just a time thing, and I was asking them for a specific date and they were like, yeah, I just can't do that. And so they would be people I could maybe go back to and we could reschedule to another time. And only one time somebody said, I only go on podcasts if I get paid, and I don't pay my guests. So that didn't work out, and that was fine. But I feel like if you're putting yourself out there and you're clear on what your topic is, and you're clear on your purpose of your podcast, and you're asking questions that are engaging for people, people are going to want to be a part of that and be able to find other ways to share their story. So I am happy to answer any questions. I put my email and my website on here as well. If you want to shoot me an email, I'm happy to answer questions. And you can check out my podcast from my joyprstudio.com website, or you can search for the Joy Curator podcast on Spotify or Apple in order to listen to any of the 133 episodes that are sitting out there right now. But happy to answer any questions. And I said this before, but there's no silly questions. You should have seen, if you could look back to my Google searches from when I started this podcast, it's hysterical. The things that you just like type in where you're like, okay, I don't even know what that word means. We're going to Google that now too, because now that's something I don't know. There's no wrong way to podcast. It's just figuring it out as you go along and what feels right for you.
That was awesome. That's a lot of information.
just jamming it all at you at once.
Does anyone have any questions for Kimberly? Here's one in the chat. If you had an account on Spotify for podcasters, do you also need one on Apple?
So I think that now, so the stuff has changed a little bit since I first launched my podcast in 2019. I think if you have one on Spotify, it also pulls to Apple now, because this is not, so Spotify for podcasters it's kind of in brackets called Anchor is what it is called. So Spotify for podcasters is like your own account that you're creating as a podcaster. It's different than your Spotify account that you would like listen to music or listen to podcasts on. Mine, I only have to upload my podcast to just that Spotify for podcasters place, and it pulls it to Apple, it pulls it to whatever, but you do have to have a few things set up on your website, on your landing page, in order to make sure that it's pulling things properly. So there are a few steps, and the website you use is what's dependent of it. Where you decide to host the podcast is dependent of it. Like there's only one way to do it. It sort of is, if you're using Spotify for podcasters, and you're using Squarespace for your website, that's one way to do it. If you're using Wix, if you're using WordPress, like whatever you're using, there's kind of a different method for every single one of them. So you kind of just need to know which platform you're using, and then you're able to kind of like Google your way through figuring out those technical answers afterwards. And there were times where I wanted to throw my computer in the garbage because I was so frustrated with figuring this out, but I just gave myself enough time and grace. I didn't give myself I have to start a podcast and I have to have 40 episodes recorded by the end of the month and make myself silly about it. So really just let this be something that you do have to prioritize it. You do have to say, if you're serious about wanting to actually launch a podcast and you really would like to do this, you kind of, I would say probably 6 months ahead of that, want to just start a little bit of a timeline where you're like, okay, I can commit to 1 hour every week of figuring out things on how I'm going to get this podcast started, rather than putting pressure onto it and having it be like a frustrating experience, would be my suggestion. Oh, another question, Angie.
Mhm.
If you were starting your podcasting journey all over again, would you be doing it the same, or would you get your podcast up and running in a different way? Good question, Angie. You know what? I think I probably would do it the same. I am very, in my business, I am like a self-made business person. I have not had anybody funding my business. I have never once in my whole career received any type of grant or loan or anything. I should have been smarter and done that ahead of time, but I did not. And this podcast was sort of one of those things where I hire stuff out for my business all the time. If I can have somebody who is way more of an expert on something than me do this faster and better, yes, that's what I choose to do. But this podcast for me, just for some reason, felt different for me. And I just knew that I wanted to be the one putting the blood, sweat, and tears into getting this going. And if I didn't get it off the ground, and I actually got so stumped in a place that I was like, okay, I'm either not doing this or I'm needing somebody to help me, I would have done that. But I got to that place, and I can't even tell you, when I launched my first episode, I don't know that I have been so proud of anything in my business as I was of getting that launched off the ground, because it just made me feel so capable and empowered that the things, even from a technical standpoint, that were not my forte at all, that I was like, what? People can actually listen to this? They can put their earbuds in. It just felt so empowering to me. So I do think I'd probably do it the same. But I'm definitely, I would say now, at a little bit of a crossroads with my podcast where I need to decide if this is something that I'm wanting to keep doing in a sense, and it's going to need to start being more monetized, or is it something that maybe I need to press pause on and come up with a bit of a different strategy? Just, you kind of, it ebbs and flows throughout, but there is really money to be made. I have paid advertisers for my podcast in certain seasons, depending on what my episodes are and stuff. And so like, it really is possible to make money, but you kind of have to get a little bit of a listener base first, because that's kind of how you charge for ads, is based on how many people you have listening to your podcast. So when you have one listener, it's not really a very attractive platform for people to advertise on yet. Good questions.
Mm-hmm.
That was great.
Yeah, so informative. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to, if no one has any more questions, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us today. On behalf of Sage Hill and the IBDS, I'd like to thank Kimberly. This has been so informative. And we hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
We have our IBDS offers a couple of sessions every month. Our next one is towards the end of November, and it's about
Meta Business Suite.
Yeah, and how that is always changing, and we always have
Mm-hmm.
questions. So that'll be the next one we have. So we're always
Mm-hmm.
trying to pick topics that, business owners, need to help, those, tools that we can use to make our life a little bit easier as an entrepreneur. So With that, I'd like to thank everybody and thank Kimberly again, and everyone have a wonderful day.
Thank you.